Everyone remembers the voice, the soft, yearning falsetto that floated through the speakers in 1977, whispering, "Love is in the air." It was the anthem of a generation, the soundtrack to countless romances, weddings, and cinematic moments. But while the song never truly faded, the man behind it, John Paul Young, seemed to vanish into thin air. How could someone who once ruled charts across continents disappear so quietly from the global stage? What happened behind the glittering lights of disco and the smile that launched 1,000 radio plays? John Paul Young didn't die. He didn't fall into scandal or disgrace. He wasn't arrested or publicly ruined. His fall was quieter, more haunting. He became the kind of legend whose biggest triumph doubled as his silent curse. For decades, people danced to "Love is in the Air" without ever asking, what happened to the man who sang it? Was it the industry that trapped him in a single sound? Or did he make choices that closed the door to the world stage? Before he disappeared from international headlines, there were signs, forgotten albums, failed comebacks, and a creative dependency on the same two men who made him a star. There was also a secret, one that may explain why he never truly escaped the shadow of one song. This is not just the story of a one-hit wonder. It's the story of how fame, when narrowly defined, can become a prison, and how the air that once carried your name can, just as easily, swallow it whole. John Paul Young was never supposed to be a star. Born in Scotland and raised in the working-class suburbs of Sydney, Australia, he began his career not with ambitions of global fame, but as an apprentice sheet metal worker. Music was a hobby, a weekend escape. But in the early 1970s, Australia was a country still finding its musical identity, a fertile ground for unexpected voices to rise. And when Young's soft tenor and easy charm were discovered by producer Simon Napier Bell, it didn't take long for fate to rewrite his future. By the time "Love is in the Air" was released in 1977, John Paul Young had already tasted modest success in Australia. He had several local hits, like "Yesterday's Hero" and "I Hate the Music," tracks that resonated on the local charts, but barely registered beyond the Pacific. What changed everything was the collaboration with the powerhouse duo Harry Vanda and George Young, former members of legendary Aussie rock band The Easy Beats. They had a golden touch, and they were determined to mold JPY into something more than just a homegrown talent. The song "Love is in the Air" was different. Euphoric, yet melancholic, it captured a universal feeling in just 4 words. The production sparkled, the beat swayed, and Young's voice? It danced lightly over every note, effortlessly charming listeners from Sydney to Stockholm. It was a global hit, entering the top 10 in multiple countries and becoming a lasting icon of the disco era. Yet behind the glitter and success was a quiet complication. Australia, during the 1970s, was building its music industry in the shadows of Britain and America. Local artists had limited infrastructure for global reach. For every artist that broke through internationally, there were dozens who didn't. Not because they lacked talent, but because the machine didn't yet exist to sustain them. John Paul Young, despite his charisma and vocal uniqueness, was a product of this time. He became internationally famous for one song, but remained tethered to a local scene that couldn't hold his momentum abroad. Even more telling, he was never in control of his own image. Vanda and Young wrote the hits, produced the albums, and shaped the sound. John Paul Young was their vessel. His career was not self-directed, but orchestrated, and that would come at a price. The world saw the charming smile, the catchy disco track, the perfectly coiffed hair. But few noticed how little the man behind it actually evolved, how little say he had in what came next. This is the starting point of the mystery. How could an artist launch one of the most enduring pop songs in history and then vanish from global relevance? As the story unfolds, we'll explore the rise, the inner workings of the music machine, the choices made for him, and those he made on his own. And eventually, we'll confront the truth that lingered behind every glittering note of his greatest hit. John Paul Young's early musical life was far from spectacular. He sang in local cover bands, most notably Elm Tree, and juggled music with his day job in metalwork. It was only by a twist of luck that his voice caught the attention of producer Simon Napier Bell, who recognized something special in the Scottish-born Aussie with the boyish grin. His breakout moment came with a song written by the now legendary duo Harry Vanda and George Young, Pasadena. Though the track wasn't a massive hit, it was the beginning of a partnership that would define and eventually confine John Paul Young's entire career. As the mid-1970s unfolded, Vanda and Young turned JPY into one of Australia's most promising pop acts. With songs like Yesterday's Hero, a track that eerily foreshadowed his future, Young's fame grew rapidly in his home country. That single was an anthem for the fleeting nature of stardom, sung by a man who had not yet tasted the very fate he was warning against. Audiences loved the irony. The glittering performances on Countdown and the waves of teenage fans cemented him as a local heartthrob. But while Australia embraced him, international markets remained uncertain. His songs had charm, but they were crafted in a world still dominated by American soul and British rock. What Young needed was a song that could transcend borders, something timeless, hypnotic, and undeniably catchy. Then came Love Is in the Air. Released in 1977, it was an instant sensation. The arrangement shimmered with disco elegance. The rhythm was light but infectious, and Young's vocal, soft, sincere, almost whisper-like, wrapped itself around listeners like perfume in the breeze. It soared to number 7 in the US, number 5 in the UK, and dominated European charts. For the first time, Australia had exported a pop star who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names of the era. But behind the curtain, trouble was brewing. John Paul Young had not written the song. He did not produce it. And despite the overwhelming success, he wasn't the architect of the magic. Vanda and George Young were. They pulled the strings, shaped the sound, and controlled the direction. JPY was, by all accounts, their muse. Charismatic, photogenic, and obedient. As disco fever gripped the world, Young toured internationally. He performed on Top of the Pops, appeared on European television, and was welcomed into the global pop scene. But the music industry was ruthless. It wanted more hits. Another Love Is in the Air. And when follow-up singles like The Day That My Heart Caught Fire or Heaven Sent didn't replicate the global success, labels began to lose interest. The pressure to repeat a phenomenon he never truly controlled wore thin. Internally, JPY was growing restless. He had a voice that could convey real emotion, but he was boxed into the soft glow bubble of disco pop. The problem wasn't his talent, it was the narrow space he was allowed to inhabit. By the early 1980s, disco was dying. The sounds that once made crowds dance became the butt of cultural jokes. Artists like the Bee Gees fought to reinvent themselves. Some succeeded, most did not. For John Paul Young, the path was harsher. Without a new sound, a new narrative, or a new team to support him, his name slowly receded from global headlines. He returned to Australia, continued performing, and even ventured into television. He hosted shows, did stage musicals, and remained a beloved figure in the local entertainment scene. But the world stage? It had moved on. The lights that once shone so brightly had turned elsewhere. From a modest apprentice to a chart-topping icon, John Paul Young's rise was meteoric. But what made him famous was also what trapped him. He became the face of a single shimmering moment in pop history, and when that moment passed, so did the world's attention. As the decades rolled on, Love Is in the Air refused to die, but John Paul Young's international music career did. The contrast was stark. The song soared through generations, featured in films like Strictly Ballroom, revived in commercials, dance floors, and nostalgia circuits. Meanwhile, its original voice, the man who gave it life, seemed increasingly disconnected from its success. He wasn't celebrated at the Grammy Awards. He wasn't headlining global tours. He wasn't even properly acknowledged in the broader pop canon. He had become a ghost, trailing behind his own song. And the question many started to ask, often silently, was, why didn't he ever come back? The answer lies in a combination of music industry politics, creative stifling, and a deep personal resignation. After the initial wave of global fame, Young attempted a string of follow-up albums, but without Vanda and Young's golden touch, or perhaps too tethered to their style, none of them landed. The late 70s and early 80s were a volatile time for pop music. Artists had to evolve or vanish. And while JPY was a willing performer, he was never allowed to shape his own artistic identity. He once admitted in an interview that he didn't even particularly love Love Is in the Air when he first recorded it. It was too light, too soft, he said, but the world loved it. So I went with it. That single sentence reveals the heart of the tragedy. He went with it and never escaped it. Worse still, industry insiders whispered that the singer had been poorly managed, that his record deals didn't secure long-term royalties, that the business side of his stardom was rushed, unprepared for global attention, and disastrously underdeveloped. He was suddenly big, but with no infrastructure to sustain it. One producer, speaking anonymously to an Australian radio station years later, remarked, "John Paul Young was like a spark in the wind, brilliant for a moment, but never protected from the storm." He continued to work, of course. In Australia, he was a regular fixture on television and variety shows. He starred in stage productions. He even released more music, none of which charted internationally. Interviews with JPY in the 1990s and 2000s revealed a man both proud and wounded. He smiled when Love Is in the Air played. But behind that smile was something unspoken, a quiet admission that the world only remembered one version of him. And that version wasn't real anymore. The emotional weight of it became clearer when the song was resurrected in Strictly Ballroom, 1992. Suddenly, a new generation embraced the tune, but barely registered the man behind it. His voice became timeless, disembodied from his aging face. He was invited to perform the song at events, always that song, but rarely asked about anything else. He wasn't an artist anymore. He was an echo. In a 2012 interview, when asked if he felt forgotten, JPY replied, "No, but I know they don't see me. They see the song, and maybe that's enough." That sentence hits like a confession. Maybe that was enough. Or maybe it was all he was allowed to have. The public never turned on John Paul Young. There were no scandals, no career-ending controversies. But perhaps that's exactly what sealed his fate. He disappeared not in disgrace, but in silence. Fame didn't devour him. It ignored him. To this day, Love Is in the Air plays on radios, at weddings, in nostalgic playlists, and each time it does, a little piece of John Paul Young reappears. Not as a man, but as a melody. And beneath that melody lies a quiet truth. Sometimes the biggest hit of your life can be the very thing that erases the rest of you. At Aussie Uncovered, we don't see John Paul Young as a one-hit wonder. We see him as a symbol, a cautionary tale wrapped in melody. A man who achieved something rare, a global anthem that transcended time, borders, and language. And yet that same achievement quietly consumed the rest of his narrative. In a world that often demands reinvention to remain visible, JPY was preserved and ultimately confined in amber. There is something uniquely Australian about his story: the modesty, the absence of scandal, the steady, almost stoic retreat into a quieter life. While other stars flamed out in public spectacle, John Paul Young simply stepped back. He embraced the roles given to him, both by industry and by fate. He toured, he performed. He became a beloved figure in local media, but the hunger to reclaim the global stage never seemed to return, or was perhaps never truly allowed. His dependence on Vanda and Young while producing remarkable music also trapped him in their creative shadow. He was the voice, but never the pen, the face, but never the architect. When they moved on, the magic faded. Not because JPY lacked talent, but because the scaffolding around him had been too tightly built. He was a product. When the factory shifted direction, he was left outside. And yet, what lingers most about John Paul Young is not failure. It's not even tragedy. It's the feeling. The bittersweet echo that Love Is in the Air still carries. It's in the nostalgia-drenched weddings where couples dance to that song without knowing who sings it. It's in the radio DJ's voice that says classic hit and moves on. It's in the way his face appears on TV every few years, singing the same refrain, always familiar, always distant. We believe JPY deserves more than a footnote in musical history. He deserves recognition as an essential thread in the tapestry of Australia's pop legacy. Not just for the song, but for the strange, quiet grace with which he handled its shadow. He never lashed out, never rewrote the narrative, never begged for relevance. He simply remained. And maybe that's why his story matters. Because not every tale of stardom ends in fire. Some end in whispers, in echoes, in a song that never leaves us, even if its singer does. What about you? When was the first time you heard Love Is in the Air? Did you know who sang it? And if not, will you remember his name now? There's something almost poetic about the way John Paul Young faded from global fame. No breakdown, no scandal, just the slow dimming of a spotlight that once burned so brightly. And yet, in that fading light, he became something rare, a living ghost of a golden age. A voice forever floating above a dance floor, caught in a moment that never truly ended. For many, Love is in the Air is just a song, a feel-good track played at weddings, in elevators, or on vintage radio stations. But for those who look closer, it's a time capsule, a trace of a man who gave the world a sound so perfect, so pure in its simplicity, that it outlived the very career it was meant to launch. There's a strange kind of immortality in that. He may not headline festivals or dominate retrospectives, but John Paul Young remains etched into the emotional memory of millions. Even if they don't know his name, they know his voice. And in the end, maybe that's the kind of legacy that matters most. Some stories scream to be told, others hum quietly in the background, waiting for someone to finally listen. Now you've heard it. Some voices never truly go silent. They just live on, in the air.